right, it
Should
is.
we get started? Do we want to give it a couple minutes? How do we want to?
I think we can get started.
Okay, sounds good.
Any question before we get started?
Yes, any questions?
Anything or any specific topics you'd like to know or hear about?
Thank you everyone for filling in the survey. It was super helpful when I was creating the slides to kind of hear about what everyone was hoping to hear about. So I'm hoping that I'm able to cover broad topics that everyone kind of mentioned, but I was talking to Dr. Ali earlier and I can stay on extra if people have questions. So I will go ahead and get started if no one has any questions.
I will keep an eye on the chat in case there's questions coming in.
Perfect. That sounds good. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, the career genetic counseling. A lot of people had questions about, how to prepare for graduate school and the applications for graduate school. So I'll be talking about that in the second half. And, feel free to throw questions into the chat. We'll have some time at the end and then, I'll have my email ID posted on the last slide. So you can always reach out to me and happy to set up some time to talk separately as well. So a little bit about me. My name is Mythili. As you can see, graduated from the University of Florida in May of 2020. So coming up on 4 years of graduation from undergrad, which is surreal to me. I graduated with a major in microbiology and cell science and a minor in bioinformatics. So I graduated during COVID, didn't have an actual graduation ceremony. But still took grad pictures and tried to celebrate in whatever way possible. So that's me when I graduated a couple of years ago. Following that, I worked at the NIH as a post-bac research fellow for 2 years. I was working in a neuro-oncology lab, so we were doing a lot of work on looking at therapeutics for brain tumors. So very cool work, felt very impactful, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, I was craving some sort of content of working with patients. So that's kind of what the transition looked like for me, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And yeah, now I'm a second year genetic counseling graduate student at Columbia. I graduate in 2 months. I'm very excited. It's been a long, long journey. So I'm excited to graduate and start working as a genetic counselor. Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what genetic counselors do. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about preparing for GC programs and then applications as well. This is a more broad overview. I'm not going into a lot of detail on every single thing, but my hope is that this provides a general landscape of things, and then we can go into more detail with specific questions that people may have. Just for, it was fun for me to see how many people had heard of genetic counseling before in the registration form. I was pleased to hear that most people have at least heard of genetic counseling. So that's a good thing. And hopefully this is not brand new information for most people. But for the 8.6% of people that don't know about genetic counseling, I hope you learned something new today. And I hope you find this to be interesting. So before we jump in, I was hoping that we could I just want to hear about why people are interested in genetic counseling, if you're exploring this as a career or if you're just interested in learning about it. So I'm going to stop sharing this for 1 second and open up my poll everywhere to just, do a quick poll and see if I can hear a little bit about your interests before we talk a little bit more. So give me a second. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh God, no, wrong thing. I have so many windows open that, okay, here we go. So that's the QR code. I can give everyone a minute if you want to use your phone, or if you're on your laptop, you should be able to join Poll Everywhere with that link as well. I can put it in the chat. That's easier. Okay, it looks like it's working, so that's a good sign. And give it a minute or so just to hear about what people's thoughts are. Advocacy, career option, sharing information with students. Bridging the gap, it's a huge one. New technology. Yep, love psych genetics helping people. Exactly. Awesome. Okay. Working with patients, helping people. Yeah, lots of common themes. Okay. So thank you so much. This gives me kind of a broad overview of what people's interest is. So can kind of tailor that a little bit more. Um, so I'm going to go back to my slideshow. Thank you all for answering that. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, so for those of you who know what genetic counseling is, this is probably familiar, but for those of you who don't, genetic counseling is the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. So this process integrates interpretation of family medical histories to assess the chance of disease occurrence or recurrence, education about different components of genetics, so inheritance, genetic testing, management around genetic information, prevention, resources, and research. And we also provide counseling to promote informed choices and adaptation to risks or conditions. So this is the definition put out by the National Society of Genetic Counselors, which is the professional society of genetic counselors. And we'll talk a little bit more about these different components, but I wanted to provide a broad definition for those of you who are not familiar with what genetic counseling is. So what does a genetic counselor do more specifically? So as the title suggests, our skill set is genetics plus counseling. So quite literally, we're trained in genetic information. So throughout graduate school, you learn about, genetics, about genetic conditions, inheritance, basically the ins and outs of genetics. And we're also trained in counseling. So we take a lot of courses on counseling, advanced counseling skills, therapeutic counseling. And so we're trained in short-term counseling as it pertains to, the adaptation to a lot of this information. But genetic counselors' roles can look very different in different spaces. So the traditional role that most people that are aware of genetic counseling know about is the clinical role, right? So you'll see genetic counselors working in the prenatal space, in the cancer space, and like pediatrics or adult genetics, cardiology, neurology, nephrology, and so many more. As we learn more about genetics, there's new specialty clinics opening up every day. There's skeletal dysplasias clinics, there's pulmonology clinics. It expands. It's been, really blowing up lately. There's also research genetic counselors. So this is different from the traditional, I guess, definition of research with what a lot of microbiome majors tend to be involved in. There's no wet lab research. It's more of, observational research, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we still do a lot of quantitative and qualitative research. So it's a lot of the same skills, but we're just not, actually doing experiments in a lab. You may work in a team with people that are doing experiments in a lab, but you're not trained to have that skill set during graduate school. And then being a genetic counselor also comes usually with education responsibilities. So since we're still a smaller field that's growing, we're all kind of learning and teaching each other. So if you're at an academic center, you're definitely going to be involved in, teaching classes and supervision as students rotate through clinic, and mentorship. So that generally is a part of the job as well. And then there's so much more that genetic counselors do and our different roles that we're moving into, that I'll also talk about in a minute. But those are some of the examples: variant curation, there's GCs in outreach roles and public policy, public health, insurance companies, kind of all over the board. And this is because genetic counselors are very versatile. So there's a lot of freedom to try out different roles throughout your career. You can be involved in any or all of these things at any given point, which is very cool because the training you receive in 2 years is, gives you enough of a background and a foundation to be able to build your skill set in different kinds of roles. So talking a little bit about clinical genetic counseling, being in a clinical role, of course, involves working directly with patients. And I know a lot of people tend to want to move towards genetic counseling because they want to have that patient confident, that patient-facing confidence. So I wanted to start off talking a little bit about this. Genetic counselors rarely work in isolation. We're usually a part of an interdisciplinary team. So in most clinics, you'll work with doctors, sometimes with social workers, NPs, care coordinators. Really just depends on the structure of the hospital. Sometimes there's, smaller genetic counseling teams, sometimes there's bigger teams, but it's very, unless you're working in private practice, usually you'll be working with some other team members as well. And to just break down a little bit more some of the roles that we have in clinical genetic counseling, we talk to patients about the genetic etiology of conditions, right? So there's a lot of patient education. A lot of people come in to genetic counseling appointments not even knowing what genetics is, let alone what a genetic condition is or what this means for their medical management. So we do a lot of patient education. We collect medical and family history. So we draw pedigrees to be able to do risk assessment. So we want to see if there's any patterns of any disease or health conditions in the family that we can, talk more with the family about and see if there's any additional testing to offer. And then, we discuss genetic testing options. So depending on the clinic and depending on the indication, there's a lot of different genetic tests, a lot of different genetic labs. So we kind of think more about what genetic test would be most relevant for the patient, how much information do they want, because there's different tiers of information that can be gleaned from different types of genetic tests. So we talk a little bit more about that. We help patients facilitate we facilitate decision making. So we help patients make some of these decisions. Genetic information is a complicated topic in the sense of, especially, younger adults who, are maybe in their early 20s, for example, in a cancer clinic, there's a lot of decision making to make around, do I want to know whether I'm at an 80% risk of developing breast cancer at the age of 50? Like there's a lot to think about in terms of values and goals and just what people are looking for out of their lives. So we do a lot of the facilitation around that. And then if people do choose to go down the genetic testing path, we disclose results to them, talk about the implications for themselves and family members. So going down the same cancer train, if someone is found to have a BRCA1 mutation, we talk a little bit more about what the options are. Is there preventative surgery, genetic testing for other family members that may be at a risk of having the same mutation? So a lot of that kind of counseling around implications. And then we help individuals kind of adjust to this information psychologically. It can be really tough. So that's why we're trained in short-term counseling, and we kind of spend some time, engaging in that kind of conversation. To give you a quick overview of what some of the patient indications may look like, because this can be kind of hard to just imagine sometimes. In the prenatal and reproductive genetics clinics, we'll see patients for preconception genetic testing. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with carrier screening, but there's certain genetic conditions that are autosomal recessive in their inheritance pattern. So if mom and dad have one mutation each in the same gene, there's a 25% risk that baby can have that condition. So there's a lot of genetic testing panels out there for carrier screening. There's panels for like between 100 and 500 different types of conditions that we can test the couple for, to see if they're a match for any of the conditions. So we do a lot of preconception genetic testing. We talk to families when there's a fetal anomaly on ultrasound or MRI. Like just yesterday, I met with a family that had kidney and heart findings on ultrasound. And, they were very worried. They were at 20 weeks of pregnancy, gestational age, trying to figure out, is termination what they want to do? Do they want to try to continue the pregnancy? So a lot of decision making in the context of fetal anomalies. And then for those of you who may have heard of prenatal genetic testing, there's tests like chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis that we can do. We can do different types of tests like karyotype, microarray, whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing to learn more about the pregnancy's genetic status. So those are tests that we offer to patients as well. And then there's a lot of patients that come in because they're undergoing IVF or pre-implantation genetic testing, and they want to talk to genetics to see if there's specific genetic considerations that need to be taken into account, especially in the context of mosaic embryo transfer. In cancer genetics, pretty straightforward in terms of indication. Most of the time we see people with a personal or family history of a variety of cancers. There are some cancers that tend to be more likely to be genetic compared to others, like some of the ones I've listed here. So we can do a lot of counseling around that and, whether people want to have genetic testing for that. And then pediatric genetics, very broad range of indications. I've listed some here, like autism, developmental delay, connective tissue disorders, hearing loss, the metabolic conditions. So it's really very broad. We'll see people for all kinds of things in the general genetics, pediatrics genetics clinic. So as I promised, coming back to the research genetic counseling piece a little bit, no wet lab work when you're a research genetic counselor. And the research is usually more observational and not as experimental. So this can be kind of hard to wrap your head around. And quite frankly, as a prospective student before grad school, I didn't really understand what this meant and that may have been my own bias because I'd come from a lot of wet lab experience, and in my head, almost it was like, what other research even exists? So that was me being naive, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of show you some of the some of the research articles that have been put out there in the genetic counseling space. There's a lot of research being done. These are just a few. But that this may give you a better understanding of what kind of research is done in this space. So, there's research around the use of AI in genetic counseling, a lot of research around parent and patient experiences around the healthcare system and around genetics and genetic testing, thinking more about the field because it's growing a lot. So, what does that look like for us in terms of our roles and how is that, progressing? A lot of conversation around telegenetics and person counseling because of this shift with COVID. Research around curriculum and genetic counseling programs. So a lot of different types of research. This is just a very small, a small sample size. There's a lot more that's done in the field, a lot around access to genetic counseling, how we can move the field forward. So the Journal of Genetic Counseling is an amazing resource. They have, I think monthly, so you can get articles, like there's so many research studies being done. So there's a wealth of information. And if you're interested in learning more about the research space in genetic counseling, that's a good resource to use. Okay. In terms of other types of roles that genetic counselors can have, I alluded to this a little bit, but some of the big other spaces that genetic counselors are in, are some of the ones I've listed here. So variant creation is a big one. Since we're trained to have that technical knowledge around genetics, there's a lot of genetic counselors that work with labs, so genetic testing companies and genetic testing labs to help with interpretation of genetic testing results. So if you think about it, there's the clinical genetic counselors that work with patients, right, to help around decision making and education and thinking about whether they want genetic testing in the first place. But then once we collect the sample, that goes off to a genetic testing lab to actually do the sequencing or actually do the interpretation, and then get results back to the patient. So that process requires a lot of interpretation of the variants that do come up, because just by being human, as we all know, we all have so many mutations and genetic changes in our genes. So, there's a lot of interpretation that and filtering that goes into, is this variant significant? Is this a variant not significant? So genetic counselors can be involved in that process of classification before giving results back to patients. There's a lot of genetic counselors that are involved in outreach efforts. So as I said a couple of times, the field is small. People are still learning a lot about genetics and genetic counseling. As a lot of you said on the call as well, that you've maybe heard of it, but don't know a lot about it. So a lot of GCs are involved in just public education. You'd be surprised how many doctors and healthcare providers don't know a lot about genetic counseling. So we do a lot of provider education as well. A lot of genetic counselors are passionate about increasing access to underserved populations. This is one of my specific passions as well. So, a lot of research and a lot of outreach work that goes into, increasing access for populations that may not have easy access to a tertiary care center or to a genetics clinic. There's genetic counselors involved in public health efforts. So I'm not sure how many of you know about the newborn screening programs that all the states in the US have, but at birth, anyone born in the US will go through certain types of tests to, for certain medical conditions. And a lot of those are genetic, or I think maybe most are, if not all, are genetic. So, genetic counselors are involved in, facilitating that, in the disclosure of those results, and especially for families that have just given birth and then have to deal with this kind of information. It's important to have GCs in that space. And then we're involved in policy work around licensure for genetic counselors, patient advocacy. I know a couple of people mentioned that they were involved, or that they were interested in the advocacy component of genetic counseling. So a lot of counselors involved in that. And then more recently, GCs have been kind of moving into the insurance space, because there's a lot of conversation around the need for reimbursement around genetic testing in order to be able to increase that access, and in order to be able to increase awareness and education. So a lot of these things are tied in together, especially with the outreach policy and insurance. So there's GCs in all of these spaces. And this is one of my favorite things about genetic counseling, because with just 2 years of training, we learned so much and have such a diverse skill set that we can be involved in all of these different aspects. And this is just a handful. There's so many other roles that genetic counselors have that I'm sure you'll notice as you learn more about this space. Okay, so that was kind of my broad overview on what genetic counseling is, what some of the big roles are that genetic counselors have. I'm just gonna check the time. Okay, in the interest of time, okay, I'm gonna keep going through this, and if there's any other questions, I will, continue. I will answer them at the end. Did my screen share stopped? Okay. So in terms of graduate school, a lot of people were curious about how to prepare for graduate school. So I will say that the biggest thing, if there is one thing you take away from this webinar, and if there's one thing that, my little nugget of advice, really, really important to know whether you want to be a genetic counselor. you need to spend the time and energy to know whether this is the right field for you. Because, and this will kind of lead into the next part of my presentation, but especially when you're applying to GC programs, it's very competitive. And programs really want to know that you understand what genetic counseling is and that you've taken the time to learn about it. And so, very important to try to shadow genetic counselors in your area. When I was making this presentation, I knew there were genetic counselors at UF, but I just did a quick search and there's a lot in a lot of different specialties at UF. So reach out to them. Genetic counselors are amazing. The whole community is very kind. Everyone's always, hoping to mentor and teach and supervise and just help with the community learning. So reach out to genetic counselors, ask them if you can shadow them for a day. Try to get involved with that, with the more practical side of it. Do informational interviews. So NSGC, which is the National Society of Genetic Counselors, has a Find a Genetic Counselor webpage where you can type in your city or state. And there's a lot of genetic counselors that are open to being contacted by students. So you can email them and ask them if they are willing to have a 30-minute conversation with you about what their day-to-day looks like and what, how they feel about the field. Watch simulated genetic counseling sessions. So these are all things I have some links for in a separate document. So after this presentation, I will send that document to I'll figure out how to do it. Either I can send it to Dr. Ali and she can send it to the whole listserv, or maybe it would be more helpful for me to put it in the chat for the people that joined the call. But I have links to all of these things that will be easier to find so that you don't have to kind of go down and find that yourself. But you can watch simulated genetic counseling sessions. And this is something a lot of people did during COVID when shadowing wasn't as much of an opportunity. There's a lot of educational opportunities for people that are interested in genetic counseling. So I've listed some examples here. There's Color Health has a very cool genetic counseling immersive program. Columbia has a GC practicum. I know that we're not the only program that does this. There's a lot of programs that have pre-genetic counseling practicums. There's podcasts you can listen to, lots of webinars and open houses that you can join to learn more about genetic counseling as a field and about specific topics within it as well. Attend journal clubs. I know UT Southwestern has an education hour for prospective students, and that's just one example because that's one of the ones I'd attended as a prospective student, but I know that there's so many journal clubs in general around genetic counseling. Join a prospective genetic counseling student group. Work as a genetic counseling assistant. I think that's a huge one. A lot of people spend 1 or 2 years between undergrad and grad being a GCA because that really gives you real insight into what it's like to be a genetic counselor because you work with genetic counselors. And then there's a lot of additional resources that I'll link in that document, but I've just listed them here in case you want to take a quick note of them. There's a lot of YouTube channels and a lot of web pages that have a very, very big wealth of resources for prospective students. So there's a lot out there if you look deep enough, and all of these things are important to kind of use as resources to know if this is the field for you. But there's also an additional component of building the counseling skill side of this, right? So a lot of prospective students work for crisis counseling centers, so like the crisis text line, 7 Cups. They are involved in community health initiatives like Planned Parenthood, peer mentorship, volunteering at hospice, elder care, long-term health facilities, or domestic abuse shelters or organizations, or even working with children or adults with disabilities. So these are just some ideas, not exhaustive by any means, but some of the more common ones that you'll see people engage in to see, if they enjoy the counseling side of this as well, because counseling is a huge part of genetic counseling. So it's important to build some of those skills before you try to apply for graduate school. In terms of the actual application process, for a broad overview, there's a lot of programs to pick from. So there's over 50 in the US and Canada. You'll notice that overall they have the same curriculum because they have to be accredited by the ACGC, which is the broader organization that kind of looks through curriculum and, sets the board exam and stuff. But each program has their own little nuances. So some programs have certain focuses versus others have, so for example, Columbia has a focus on the social justice framework, does a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work. Every program is slightly different in what they emphasize on, but overall you'll be learning the same things, doing the same clinical rotations. The expectations for research are a little bit different in different programs. Columbia requires us to do an independent thesis project, but I know of some programs that do capstone projects in groups or that don't even have to do a capstone project. So it's really, the research part can be variable, but in terms of what you learn in your rotations, going to be very similar across the board. So you can't really go wrong. You're going to be trained with the same set of skills. But it is very competitive. So it's, as I mentioned, it's important to know that you want to be in the field, important to highlight your experience, because they want to know that you know what you're getting into. And they can usually tell from your personal statement and from the interview. So very important. Most programs are about 2 years long. Cohorts have an average of 10 to 12 students. I know some programs that have 4 or 5, some that have 20. So it tends to be an average of about 10 to 12. Columbia has 12, which is, pretty much the number I've seen across the board for most programs. For timeline, just to mention, 10 to 12 students per cohort. So in total, we have 24 students across both cohorts. Applications usually open in August and September, so towards the end of the summer, early fall. Most are due between November and January. I would say most are due November, December, and there's a couple of programs that have stuff due in January. Interviews are in February and March, so every program is going to have you interview with them if they, offer you an interview. You have to submit your rankings for the programs that you interviewed with in April. So a little bit different from other graduate programs where you either get in or you don't get in. Genetic counseling master's programs use like the residency system where you have to match with the program. So you rank programs that you interview with and they rank you. And then there's like the back end algorithm that we don't know much about, like how they do it, but they essentially rank people or they match people, sorry. So the match day is in April, usually towards the end of April, and then programs start in August. It's a little bit about the timeline. So just ending on, a lot of people ask me like why I chose genetic counseling, and I think the answer is very different for a lot of different people. I mean, everyone goes into different fields for different reasons, but I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about my specific interest. So as some people mentioned in the little polar survey that I did, I thought that it was a really good combination of technical science and psychology. I loved that combination and that I have training in both of them. I wanted to work with patients, but I also wanted to have the opportunity to engage in a variety of roles through my career. So I wanted to work in different specialties. I wanted to have different types of roles because I love learning. So I didn't want to be, I didn't want to have to just do one thing. I wanted to have the opportunity to do a lot of things. The field is also growing and there's a lot of collective passion and determination that you can see in genetic counselors. And I was really drawn and gravitated towards that. And very welcoming community, very strong emphasis on mentorship. And I loved that because I'm all for mentorship, as Dr. Ali knows. She was a huge mentor for me during my undergrad. And I have always placed a lot of emphasis on mentorship and wanting to give back and be a mentor at some point in my life. And then also an opportunity to be a part of the new era of precision medicine. So these were some of my reasons, but every GC you speak with will have slightly different reasons. Some people wanted to hear about my life as a genetic counseling student at Columbia. You'll see that's my cohort on the right. 5 points if you can spot me. But, quick overview, as I mentioned a little bit, we have coursework in genetics and counseling spread over 2 years. We all go through clinical rotations in prenatal genetics, cancer genetics, and pediatrics. and one additional specialty clinic. So we start with observing and shadowing, and then over the 2 years build into running entire clinic sessions. So at this point in my training, because I'm graduating in 2 months, I'm essentially running entire clinic sessions under supervision. And then we have a thesis project that we do at Columbia. There's a lot of co-curricular involvement that I'm happy to talk more about if people are interested. And I promise, this is my last slide. According to the NSGC, the profession has grown by 100% since 2010. So it is on the rise. There's a lot of interest, a lot of people moving into this space. There's a projected growth of 88% over the next 10 years. So there's a lot of recruitment, a lot of interest in genetics, as you can expect. As we learn more about genetics, people are more interested in it. And it does rank as #1 in the best healthcare support jobs. Genetic counselors love to do what they do. And I can attest to that. I love genetic counseling. It's the perfect fit for me, and happy to talk more about, my experience if anyone's more curious. But that's all I have. And I'm sorry I went over by a couple of minutes, but I think Dr. Ali put my email in the chat, and so I'm always happy to answer questions via email, but I have time up until 12 o'clock actually, so I'm happy to stay on for an extra 20 minutes if people have questions. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm going to just, if people don't mind, let me just put in the post webinar survey, if you don't mind filling that in. It'll just take a couple of minutes to just hear about how this was for people and whether this was helpful, because I'm hoping to be able to do this more and just learn about what was helpful and not. But just want to open the floor for any questions that people have and anything people would like to hear about in more detail. Yeah, go for it, Emma.
Awesome. So, I have a question. First of all, though, great public speaking job. I certainly learned a lot from this seminar. So, great job on your slides. I felt like they were very comprehensive.
Thank you so much.
I did want to ask, how has your experience in bioinformatics fit into your career as a GC?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I see bioinformatics, it kind of in my brain is split in two different ways. So there's a side of bioinformatics that involves more of like learning the languages like R and Python, right? I wouldn't say that has been a huge part of my experience as a genetic counselor. I think coding is one of those skills that's useful in any field. So it could definitely be something that you use in the research space. I haven't used it up until this point. But then I also took a lot of classes on like the GUI side, so more of like the graphical user interface stuff with Dr. DeCracy. I'm not sure if you all have interfaced with her in any capacity, but I did a lot of work around like identifying functions of genes with unknown functions, for example. And I would say that work is a little bit more helpful in that it teaches you about how to look at different databases and get different kinds of information from different places and use it to get a hypothesis. So as I was mentioning with variant curation, that's one of the roles that genetic counselors have. Very similar, where you're essentially taking a variant in a gene and looking at different databases to see what information is out there about this gene or about this variant. So those skills were very helpful for me, and actually gave me a very good head start in variant creation. And because of my love for bioinformatics and my interest in bioinformatics, I actually want to do variant creation moving forward as well, because I thought that a lot of the skills and a lot of the work I did there was translated very well. So excellent question. Those are skills that will definitely come in handy.
Thank you. That answers my question. I do have a few more, but I'll let some other people go first.
Okay, perfect.
Anybody else? Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. We're a small group. If people are shy to unmute, you can also put a question into the chat box. So whatever works. If not, Emma, you can go ahead too. Oh, Shelby. Go ahead.
Yes. I know you mentioned continuing like observational research and stuff, and you're doing a thesis. Are there opportunities for genetic counselors to pursue continuing this observational research and doing like a PhD and stuff like that?
Yeah, so at this point, there isn't a formal PhD program for genetic counselors. The training that we receive as master's students is enough to take the certification exam. So there's a broad national certification exam you have to take to be a certified genetic counselor and work with patients. So all you technically need is a master's. There is conversation in the field about what higher education could look like for genetic counselors, but at this time, that's kind of a big question mark. I will say, though, that a lot of people that are interested in higher education and PhDs get PhDs in education, in policy. There's some genetic counselors that get law degrees because if they want to use their genetic counseling skills in specific places like policy or law, a higher education degree is helpful. So lots of flexibility. There's a lot of opportunity to be creative. And I know a lot of people that get PhDs after GC school and build on their skill set. Good question.
I have a question as well.
Yeah, of course.
So the main looking at genes, mutations, and SNPs is probably the key thing. Do you also look at epigenetics and expression?
Not yet. Good question. We actually talked about that a little bit in the program. Epigenetics is an evolving space for us. I would say epigenetics, polygenic risk scores, those are things that we briefly talk about, but we just don't know enough about it that we can be counseling patients on this. We don't even have tests per se that are patient facing that we can use to kind of provide that kind of information. So yes, as you said, a lot of what we do is on like chromosomes, on, micro deletions, micro duplications, and like gene changes, SNPs. But yeah, I'm really excited to see how epigenetics and polygenic risk scores kind of evolve into our role. And it's just a matter of time. It will come. There's a lot of conversation around it. So
And afterwards, you have the genetics of the microbes in your intestines and other.
I know, exactly. So it just goes on and on. There's so much to learn.
It's a great field.
Yeah. Okay, I see a question in the chat. I'm going to read it out. Being a microbiology and cell science major, how did you get all the qualifications in order to be considered for the program? I know most schools require you to take psychology and statistics. Yeah, good question. So my journey with genetic counseling is actually very interesting. I didn't talk about this a lot during the presentation, but for the longest time, I was on the PhD track. So I spent a lot of my undergrad doing work to go and get a PhD. At the NIH, I was doing work to prepare myself for a PhD. So I actually didn't know I wanted to get into genetic counseling until a year before I applied to graduate school, or just I would say maybe 8 to 9 months before I applied. So luckily, my microbiome degree at UF was excellent in preparing me for all the classes. So I actually didn't have to take any extra classes. A lot of students that are from other programs or that do only a psychology major, for example, have to take more of those hard science classes because that's not covered in their curriculum. As a microbiome major, all of my core classes were covered, right? And so I didn't have to worry about that. But there are a lot of people that are applying for school that don't have that. And there's a lot of these schools that offer, I don't know what they're called, but there's these like one-off courses that you can take to fulfill requirements. You don't have to be enrolled at the university. And a lot of people do that as well, especially if they're coming from more social sciences spaces.
And that's okay, that's accepted.
Yeah, that's accepted. Yeah, there's some that are accredited or that have that qualification, and that's easy to find. There's a lot of resources on the NSGC website and the ACMG website, the National Genetic Organizations that have information about those courses. So that's not that hard to find, and they are accepted by programs. Just checking the question again. Statistics is a requirement, yes, for a lot of programs, but not all. I did take a couple of stats classes during my undergrad. One was with Dr. Ali, actually. It wasn't really a pure stats class, but it had a component of that. And so I was able to talk with them and kind of explain to them. They wanted to see the syllabus, so I sent that to them and they were able to use that. So you have to work with programs a little bit sometimes. But psychology, I haven't seen, well, I guess it is in some programs, but again, I did take a psych class as my elective in my undergrad. So yes, it's a good point that you should go through the different class requirements for programs. But I'll say for the most part, the UF microbiome degree prepares you very well in terms of coursework. So if you're kind of fulfilling those requirements, you're going to have at least 90% of what you need. Does that answer your question, Caitlin? Perfect. Does your program take AP credits for some prerequisites? No, they all have to be college level classes. Because the genetic counseling graduate program, a prerequisite is having an undergraduate bachelor's degree. So high school classes and IB and AP credits don't work, unfortunately.
Emma, go ahead.
All right, I'll go again.
Yeah.
So I was curious about your experience in internships and if you got any as an undergrad, if you did any as a graduate student, and if so, how did you get your internships?
Yeah, so let's see. I'm thinking back. In undergrad, I did one internship. A lot of my, I guess, internships or like experience outside school was in research. So I worked in a lot of labs over maybe like 3 or 4 different labs over the course of my 4 years. I only did one summer internship, I believe. And that was also in a wet lab environment. So, or actually, no, that was in a bioinformatics space. So I wouldn't say that I had like internships every summer and that per se played into it so much. During graduate school, you don't, at least in Columbia's program, you don't get a summer off. You're taking classes through the whole summer. So it's a very rigorous program. And they don't expect you, and most genetic counseling programs don't expect you to be doing things outside the program because they have everything inbuilt. So rotations, thesis work, classes, everything is inbuilt into the program. So all of your internships will be through your graduate program, and will mainly entail clinical work. So you generally don't have to worry about finding something outside, which is kind of cool. It's less flexibility, but it's also nice to not have to, kind of go and apply for separate things. Has pros and cons.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Next for you, and what is the average salary of a genetic counselor to start with, and where can it lead to?
Yes, good question. So average, it depends by state. This is something I'm looking at a lot because I'm applying for jobs right now. There's something called the professional status survey, which assesses all this information about genetic counselors every year. I would say on average, it starts at about 80,000. Like it's an average across states. But of course, based on cost of living, there's some that are lower at like 75, some that are a little bit higher at 85 or 90. And it kind of goes up all the way to about 200,000 on the upper end. Because especially if you work in roles in industry or if you work as like, in education, there's a lot of opportunity to be program directors in academia. And so the scale is very broad. So it tends to be that if you're clinic facing, you're a little bit on the lower end. If you move more into the academia, education, industry side, it starts going above 100,000, 150,000. So, and then of course, as you build more experience, that jumps up and up. So it's a broad scale. I would say anywhere between 70 and 200,000 is kind of the broad scale, but you start between 70 and 90 in a clinic role.
And that's with 2 years, of education. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And in life, probably you have more like a 9 to 5 job rather than a 24/7 job, right?
Exactly, because PhDs and that's definitely a lot more. You're not doing wet lab research, so you don't need to go in on a Saturday and make sure that your cells are growing. So it's a slightly different experience. It is a rigorous program for sure, so that there's a lot of work to do because you're doing so many different rotations and taking so many classes, but it's a different kind of rigorous than a PhD program. So if people are interested in going to genetic counseling graduate school and want to learn more about those specifics, I'm also happy to talk more about my experience with that. But my experience is specific to Columbia, and I know different programs have different levels of rigor. So I don't want to, speak for other programs, but can definitely speak to my own experience with that.
Emma, you have
Wonderful questions, everybody. I'm so glad people are interested and staying on to ask questions. So please keep going if we have more.
I have one. You referenced earlier that you discovered genetic counseling like a year before you applied, and that was a little bit later in your career. So how did you finally discover it and then do the research to figure out that that is actually what you want to pursue?
Excellent question. So when I was at the NIH, it was interesting because the year that I joined was when COVID had just kind of hit and things were kind of rough. So I did a lot of work from home for the first couple of months. I was remote. And I would go in every now and then, but I quickly started realizing that something about that wasn't clicking for me. Like I didn't feel that spark with the work I was doing. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very important work, but I just couldn't see myself doing it forever. So I started signing up for all of these. NIH was awesome. The post-bac program does an extremely good job with helping with career development. So they have a lot of these webinars and a lot of these career exploration seminars where people from different fields come in and just talk about what they do. Because the NIH is like a melting pot of students that are interested in medicine and healthcare, but from different spaces. So not everyone's trying to get a PhD or go to med school. Like there's people doing all kinds of things. So in one of those seminars, there was a genetic counselor that came on and talked about what she did. And I was like, huh, this is perfect. This is exactly what I'd like to do. Like, I love that exactly what she's talking about. So then I kind of just spent the next couple of days doing more research and then just went crazy with all of the things that I kind of listed on the slides. Just did a lot of research, talked to a lot of genetic counselors, started shadowing. So I kind of had a part-time job with my full-time job, which got pretty crazy, but so worth it because it just affirmed that I was really interested in it and this is what I wanted. So that's kind of how I discovered it. It was an interesting journey with COVID too. So but because of COVID, I feel blessed because I had a little bit more time. Since I was working from home for some time, my job gave me a little bit more time to kind of do some of these things. And as a post-bac, there was an expectation that you're doing career exploration as well. They build in some time to do that. So it was a great time for me to discover and learn. And I shadowed some GCs at the NIH as well. And for those of you who are genuinely interested in genetic counseling as a career, I highly, highly recommend reaching out to genetic counselors at UF. There's a lot. I just did a quick search and there's definitely a couple, if not way more that I didn't see. Reach out to them if you haven't already and just tell them you're interested and would like to talk to them and would like to shadow them. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to, and that's a huge asset in your application as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anything else I can answer for people?
Emma, is your list empty?
Well, I have one more question, but I know you did say you have to go at 12, so I wanted to
No,
give
we're good.
somebody
It's
else.
okay. I have a couple of minutes. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I was curious, are there opportunities for hybrid jobs in genetic counseling?
Mhm.
Yes?
Yes,
Could you speak
absolutely.
a little bit more to that, what that would entail, what kind of jobs those would be?
For sure, yeah. So the cool thing about genetic counseling is with COVID coming around, there's a lot of transition to telegenetics. And so we do a lot of our patient sessions on Zoom or on virtual platforms. And I mentioned briefly too, there's a lot of this push in the field to increase access to genetic counseling for underserved populations. There's a lot of people with that passion. So telegenetics is one of the ways to do that, right? For people that live far away from a tertiary care center. So telegenetics is huge. There's a lot of companies that do purely telegenetics work. Even at Columbia, my rotations, most of them are hybrid. So we do some sessions online, some in person. So you're trained for that through graduate school too, to be able to, do sessions on the phone, on Zoom, in person. So you have those modalities. And there's a lot of jobs in the hybrid and remote space. So, you can have a purely clinical role in, as a remote job or as a hybrid job. A lot of research work or variant creation work. Variant creation, I think almost everyone is purely virtual because you kind of just work with the lab and you have to just do a lot of analysis on, if you have any familiarity with bioinformatics, it's a lot of just research and looking through databases and collecting information. So you don't have to be in person. You can have meetings on Zoom to have those conversations. So a lot of variant creation that's done in remote jobs. You can do research projects. So I would say there's very few GCs that are actually 100% in person these days. There's a lot of hybrid. Even if they don't publicize that per se, most people are at least on some level hybrid.
That's great to know because I feel like that's kind of important to me in choosing a career is one that's flexible and you can work from home some days, you can go into the office other days. So it's good to know that's an option in GC work.
For sure. You'll find a lot of that in this world.
That's a great question. Your classes are in person though, right?
Yes, all of our classes are in person. But rotations are a mix. But I will say that there are some genetic counseling programs that are actually fully remote. So in order to increase access to genetic counseling education, and a lot of people come into genetic counseling as a second career, third career. And so I think it's Boise State that has a completely virtual program. And so classes, rotations, everything is online. And so there's people from all over the country that actually enroll in the program. They're able to do school virtually. In Boise State, and there may be one or two more that have more of a virtual component. I can look into it more if you guys are interested, but there's definitely those options for school as well. Columbia has a lot of in-person, but that's just, yes, Julia, yeah, Bay Path is online.
I have one last question. I heard recently that obesity is a genetic disease. Do you agree or disagree?
Opacity is genetic disease?
Obesity.
Obesity, oh, no, I disagree.
Me too.
We talk about this a lot because we get a lot of referrals for obesity, not a genetic disease. There's no data out there that for sure links any sort of obesity with any genetic component. So 0 on 10.
All right. So thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much about it. We'll post the recording, and if you send me the link, the Word document links and stuff, I will send it around as well and send it back to the listserv and keep it also on our Vimeo site and then distribute it wherever I can. It's an amazing feeling, especially with so much new things coming along. I mean, it's really exciting.
It's very exciting. I'll definitely, Dr. Ali, send you that document. It would be great if you could post that if people want those resources. And my email ID is in the chat. Please reach out to me. I love talking to prospective students. I did a lot of this as a prospective student, so I love chatting with people about my love for genetic counseling or just about life in general. I love talking. So always happy to chat with any of you. And I'm so glad that you all jumped on today, and I hope this was helpful for you and answered some of your questions.
That's fantastic. Thanks for your time, Mythili.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ali. It was good to see you. Bye.
Bye. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.